We're going to talk about Cuba, and it's hard to have a conversation about Cuba, admittedly, without venturing into political topics, but we're going to try not to make this a political conversation because it really isn't. This panel was born out of our curiosity to find out what's going on with Cuba, not only in terms of infrastructure and capacity and what's there and what isn't and why not, but what does exist, what opportunities is it creating, what doesn't exist, if it existed, what opportunities can it open. So with that, I'm going to introduce the moderator who's then going to introduce the panelists, and you may know her. She is a TV personality in Univision. Her name is Gloria Ordaz. And Gloria is Cuban, actually has lived longer in Cuba than she's lived here, so it's a perfect person to moderate this panel. Please give her a round of applause.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much for being here today beside the rain. And I was born in Cuba when we didn't have Wi-Fi, direct Wi-Fi in Cuba. So a lot of changes had happened since I came from Cuba in 1998. I want to welcome our panelists, Ambassador Daniel Sepúlveda from the State Department, also Ted Henken, Associate Professor at Baruch College, Sean Goforth, Director of Research at Nearshore Americas, also Raúl Moas, Executive Director of Roots of Hope, and the Cuban blogger, the blog of Chiringa de Cuba, Carlos Alberto Perez, who came from Cuba yesterday, right? 2 days ago. So Carlos Alberto lives in Cuba and knows very well the challenges and how to connect to internet in Cuba. I want to start with Ambassador Sepúlveda. You recently traveled to Cuba, and I would like to know basically what is the State Department doing to try to connect people inside Cuba?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Gloria, for putting this together, and to my fellow panelists. And what we went down there to do in March, I took a group of experts from the government to talk about the state of telecommunications and internet access in Cuba, what goals Cuba has set for itself, and then what information, guidance, or models we can provide to help them reach those goals that they've set for themselves. Not because this is to give everyone an opportunity to talk, I don't want to talk too much, but our goal is essentially to ensure, and we've already done this, the legal and regulatory space for American communications and internet companies to enter Cuba, to work with the Cubans, to make their services available to Cubans. And now it's in part up to the Cuban government and Cuban public policy to enable Cubans themselves to access those services. We have seen some very positive changes. There's been expansion in access to public Wi-Fi spots. There's been a reduction in the cost of accessing the internet. And we have very positive conversations going on between our two governments. And independent of our government, American firms are going down to Cuba and engaging in their own negotiations and dialogue with the Cuban monopoly service of Atexa there.
Ambassador, I want to be sure that everybody knows that this is going to be a conversation not focused on politics, but basically on how we can help, Cuban people to get in contact with technology. But beside that, it is impossible to mix, politics with the reality in Cuba right now in terms of internet. How was your experience in Cuba? I'm pretty sure that you have your phone right there and you have access to the internet. How was the experience from the time that you get to Cuba and trying to connect to the internet?
The communications infrastructure in Cuba is extremely poor. They have only second-generation mobile wireless connectivity, and in the homes, only 3% to 5% of homes have access to the internet. So what Cuba needs is a massive investment in infrastructure in the first instance. So you need an investment in wireless towers, you need an investment in wireless technology, you need to allow phones to come into the market that can operate on advanced networks, and you need to construct partnerships to enable that. So what we were there to talk about is what we've seen work around the world to create enabling environments for investment and the deployment of services. And that's the conversation that we had with the Ministries of Foreign Trade and Investment, the Ministry of Communication, and some independent experts, including some independent bloggers in Cuba.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ted, I know that you want to emphasize on the explosion of innovative ways that Cubans are using social media and digital technology, despite or even because of the continued obstacles to internet access on the island. Basically, that Airbnb, el paquete, those kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a whole range of things that are happening totally independent of what U.S. policy is and what U.S.-Cuba relations are like. The Cubans on the island have been, very creative. There's a thing that's called el invento cubano. Cualquier cubano sabe de lo que estoy hablando, right? It's kind of a way to make a way out of no way, and there's a lot of obstacles in Cuba, whether they're technological, economic, or political, and Cubans have become expert at finding shortcuts, at inventing ways. Carlos Alberto Perez, who's here, can talk a lot more about specific ways that you can kind of have internet without the internet, or do a lot of things that are offline, and then, maximize the $2 you spend to get online for 1 hour, and in 5 minutes upload your post, or download a bunch of information that you already have subscribed to, and it just automatically goes into your flash drive. So there's all kinds of ways, and he could be much more specific than I on that topic, but there is a whole range of things, including this weekly packet of information that has wide distribution. It's monetized, it's highly organized. It seems to be largely spontaneous and not centralized, meaning it's not one paquete, but there are many different paquetes in terms of people going to get information. That information comes from various sources. It's still kind of a mystery exactly quién es por detrás del paquete, who's behind it, how many. I just got an email from a reporter who just got back from Cuba who did a story on the paquete, and he's like, I'm trying to figure out a way to find out how many people actually get access to it and how much money, income it generates. Somebody...
And did you find out?
There's a lot of estimates. One person actually says that el paquete is the largest private employer in Cuba. If you think of it as one firm, it's not one firm, it's a diffuse kind of association of people who have these chains of people who distribute the paquete, people who collect the information on the paquete. And one of the fascinating things about the paquete is that it actually has advertisements. So people who have opened up restaurants in Cuba, people who are working in the small, I call it a private sector. The government likes to call it a non-state sector, right, with its euphemistic language. But there are people who are trying to reach the people who see the paquete and put their restaurant or their repair service. So there's a whole range of things that are happening there. There's also, I think, the Cuba Craigslist, Rebolico, which many Cubans already know about here, the way that people get access to goods that may be really expensive in the government stores or just simply unavailable. But in Cuba, there's kind of this idea that todo está prohibido, pero vale todo, right?
Claro.
Everything is prohibited, but anything goes. And so looking behind the rules and seeing how people survive is one thing that I'm really interested in.
Sí, está prohibido, pero el gobierno de alguna manera sabe que existe y deja que eso suceda y lo quita y vuelve a dejarlo, y así es como funcionan las cosas en Cuba. Me gustaría que Carlos Alberto nos ahondara un poquitico más en exactamente cómo funcionan estas personas que venden el paquete, porque de alguna manera se sabe que son personas que sí tienen la infraestructura en su casa, ¿no? Y también lo que es la antena para recibir todos los canales del exterior y poder grabarlo, y los programas que le interesan al pueblo cubano.
Mira, la gente incluso dice que el paquete viene de Miami. Fíjate, hay muchas versiones. Lo que sí es seguro es que quien está detrás del paquete tiene una conexión privilegiada en Cuba. Ya lo mismo puede ser los servidores de una institución, de una empresa o algo, pero no...
¿De una empresa gubernamental?
Sí, de una empresa gubernamental.
Es decir, el gobierno sabe que el paquete existe y lo está dejando.
Lo sabe, lo está dejando. Lo que no han podido es como que llegar a la punta del hilo, ¿no? A la punta final del hilo, pero para tú poder distribuir un hard drive con 1 terabyte de información semanalmente, estamos hablando de todas las novelas de Univision, de Telemundo, de Discovery Channel, de los videos más exitosos de YouTube. Esto indiscutiblemente requiere una conexión bastante grande de descarga, y en una semana es imposible hacerlo. Por tanto, yo creo que incluso La red es mucho más grande y bueno, me han dicho que hasta se separa por diferentes departamentos, ¿no? Tú descargas esto, descargas esto, después hacemos el paquete y salimos y lo vendemos. Se vende a 12 UC, lo que viene siendo $2 semanales por persona, y es muy cómico porque a quien te toca la puerta, tum tum, hola, traigo el paquete. Entonces te dan
Porque van casa por casa.
Van casa por casa, es algo muy, muy interesante. Y entonces, pues ahí estamos viendo nosotros El Señor de los Cielos y Primer Impacto y todas esas cosas que están viendo ustedes aquí, lo que nosotros lo vemos con una semana de retraso, ¿no? Y entonces, pues así lo tiene el barrio entero. Se dice también que en la flota que hay negocio con la flota de ómnibus nacionales que mandan con los mismos choferes los hard drive para todas las provincias diariamente y entonces por eso es que llega tan rápido, ¿no? Y que entonces evidentemente hay una red detrás de todo esto que cobra su dinero y que está empleando en toda Cuba a muchísima gente.
Carlos Alberto, nosotros nos reímos de eso porque nos suena cómico y quizás simpático, pero la realidad es que es un pueblo tratando de obtener información y tener acceso, lo que prácticamente nosotros tenemos gratuitamente o lo podemos pagar y no se nos dificulta. Es un pueblo tratando de obtener información. Perdona el teléfono. ¿Qué hay que hacer en Cuba? ¿Cuáles son los desafíos que se enfrentan? Porque no todo el mundo tiene $2 a la semana para poder pagar el paquete. Entonces, ¿qué se necesita en este momento en Cuba para que las personas puedan tener más acceso a Internet, más acceso a información o al menos más acceso a ese paquete a pesar de que llegue de manera retrasada?
Bueno, la gente utiliza alternativas. Es decir, yo nunca he pagado el paquete porque lo copia un amigo mío. Y ya lo copia un amigo mío y a la vez que lo copia, socio, tú no me lo vas a cobrar a mí, ¿verdad? Y yo lo copio. Y entonces así lo copia muchísima gente. Por eso la estimación que se puede hacer del paquete nunca va a ser exacta, porque lo copia una gente y entonces después lo copia la cuadra entera. Y así llega mucha información. Llegan revistas, estamos hablando de las revistas, los mismos revistas cubanas que se están haciendo como Vistar Magazine, o pueden estar llegando revistas de vanidad, pero también llega revistas de tecnología, de todo.
¿Cómo llega? ¿Personas que la traen desde acá, desde el exterior?
No,
o
se descargan igual. Es decir, todo eso está en la web, se descarga y ya te digo, esta gente tienen indiscutiblemente muy bien focalizados los puntos de descarga y van ahí semanalmente y vamos, es como un torrente que se baja y se descarga. Más internet, bueno, hay que pedírselo al gobierno, por supuesto. Es decir, la única forma que podemos tener más acceso a las cosas es teniendo internet. Al paquete le dicen el YouTube cubano. Es decir, le dicen el YouTube cubano porque en YouTube tú puedes ver todo lo que tú quieras. Entonces, bueno, el paquete es nuestro YouTube cubano, con una semana de retraso, pero por lo menos estamos haciendo algo.
Claro, hay que pedírselo al gobierno. ¿Y tú que estás viviendo allá adentro, qué disposición ves por parte del gobierno para que eso se logre?
Yo creo que la voluntad política existe, ¿no? Yo lo que creo es que va muy lento. Es decir, yo vengo lobbyando hace 5 años con herramientas y trucos que me he tenido que inventar y que hemos tenido que compartir diferentes colegas de cómo bloquear el bloqueo americano, pero de cómo bloquear el bloqueo interno también, ¿no? Y yo creo que sí, que la voluntad existe, ya hay 35 puntos Wi-Fi, hay un plan por ahí que está dando vuelta que dice que van a poner internet en los hogares.
Está dando vuelta.
Sí, está dando vuelta, eres a lo de mi mente, pero está dando vuelta.
It's walking around.
Parece que sí, ojalá ya antes de fin de año, una fuente mía allá en Cuba me decía, antes de fin de año te vamos a dar una sorpresa, ojalá y así sea. Pero igual yo creo que necesitamos el apoyo y la ayuda de entes exteriores. Acaba de ir Google a Cuba y entonel segundo secretario del partido diciendo que no se refirió directamente a Google, pero dijo, hay empresas que nos los han ofrecido gratis, pero esto podría minar la capacidad ideológica de nuestros jóvenes. A estas alturas con ese discurso es imposible. Entonces, también alguien dijo, cuando la propina es tan grande, hasta el mendigo se asusta, ¿no? Y entonces creo que es lo que está pasando. Y indiscutiblemente tiene que ir o una empresa americana, o china, o coreana, o la que sea, a ir a Cuba y a invertir en infraestructura. Porque al paso que vamos, nos vamos a estar conectando cuando la internet esté así. Entonces vamos a llegar nosotros a conectarnos con cable a Cuba.
Raúl, I know that you have been traveling to Cuba a lot with Roots of Hope. And what can you tell about this?
Bueno, todo lo que dijo Carlos Alberto es exacto y así es. I would also like then tying it back to social media week, right? And this idea that Ted was saying, Cuban ingenuity. In Spanish, in Cuba, the term is resolver, resolve, right? And if there's a will, there's a way. And in a very perverse manner, the current system has helped entrepreneurs, natural-born entrepreneurs, hone their skills. Because every morning they wake up and say, where's the opportunity? How do I get ahead today? Where can I make a buck or two, right? And so now that there is more opening for entrepreneurs to do that, they're flourishing in some ways. And one of the ways they're doing that is around social media, digital advertising. You wouldn't think that Cuba would be inventing, or would be there would be a community or an industry or a sector for this, but in fact there is, and it's at the intersection of technology and entrepreneurship that Cuba is changing the most, right? Those two forces are what's changing the country. The small businesses that the government is now allowing, and the greater access to technology and or connectivity. And so in Cuba you'll see that a restaurant, a paladar, right, a small restaurant, will go to somebody whom they've heard through the grapevine, has access to all of Cuba's 3 million cell phones, right? So Cuba has one telco provider, Cubacel, and every few months, somebody in Cubacel sells the customer list as if someone has stolen AT&T's customer list, sold it in the black market, sold all the time, right? It comes to Miami, everybody has it, 20, 30 bucks, you have 3 million Cuban phone numbers. And so people on the island will segment that and say, well, these are the numbers from Havana, these are the numbers from Santa Clara, these are the numbers from Camagüey. So if you have a restaurant in Santa Clara, you can pay this person $10 and they will send people from Santa Clara who have phones, those numbers, they'll send them whatever message you want. Those messages are usually like the daily deal, right? The Groupon of the week for that restaurant, right? So Gloria's Paladar will say, pan con vite, 2 cooks, right? And Cubans then receive this and say, well, I'm going to go to Gloria's Paladar and I'm going to have pan con vite for 2 cooks.
Yeah, the cooks are the dollars in Cuba, basically,
right.
No? The convertible.
Exactly. And so I think it's interesting how, again, ingenuity, Cuban resourcefulness, right? Even when the government didn't say it's permissible, Cubans will find a way to get it done because the market drives that. And so what we're seeing, the fallout of what we've seen in our work, and at Roots of Hope, we promote a better Cuba through technology and entrepreneurship, and bringing young people from Cuba and the outside together for personal exchange. What we're seeing is that young Cubans who are hungry to feel citizens of the 21st century, they want to feel like they belong in 2015. What we're seeing is that they're finding ways to make that happen in their own context. And we're also seeing that they are no longer seeing themselves as passive recipients of information. Instead, they are content producers. They share and disseminate information, and they receive information that hasn't been censored, right? And that applies from original content produced in Cuba, like the magazine Vistar, to CNN, to Univision, whatever it is. So it's interesting to see how they're developing their own notion of what social media is. If you ask a Cuban, and there's a poll Ben Dixon and Amandi did, they asked, do you have a social media account? And only 20%, or have you ever used social media? 20% of Cubans said yes. When asked, have you ever signed on to Facebook? 60% of Cubans said either they had heard of it or had signed on, right? So they don't even associate the phrase social media, right? Doesn't even resonate in the way that it does here, but they recognize the potential behind it. And I think the smart brands, the brands that do want to do business in Cuba, are the ones that are thinking, what are the avenues to get to the Cuban audience? It's not Google AdWords, it's not online digital, it's in paquete. And you're seeing some American firms place ads in paquete already, in the package. So yeah, everything you said is absolutely right, and beyond that, it's taken on a life of its own.
Sean, let's talk about the ICT infrastructure. I know that you have a lot to talk about that.
Yeah, so just to build on Ambassador Sepulveda hit on this, and in different ways, I suppose we're all going to be talking about this. It's bad. That's putting it mildly. That's putting it mildly, but it's bad in a peculiar way, which is to say, is this? So the telephone infrastructure is actually quite comparable to other parts of the Caribbean, smaller countries in Latin America, but it was never built on with a fixed line broadband. So whereas throughout much of the Caribbean, much of Latin America, there's a pretty strong correlation between the number of fixed line telephone subscriptions and fixed line broadband subscriptions of about 3 or 4 telephone subscriptions to one broadband subscription. In Cuba's case, there are 200 telephone lines for every fixed broadband subscription. So it's essentially non-existent. And you know, this is really now eventually becoming, you know, a point of greater awareness for the government, and it looks like things are starting to change. The last hope of the previous model of the government for how to deliver better access was probably this submarine fiber optic cable that ran from Venezuela called the ALBA 1. It was announced to some fanfare in 2007, and the government promoted this initially as, you know, delivering 1,000-fold gains, and it was really going to help Cubans and researchers in lots of different ways. Cost overruns and delays, ultimately the thing really sort of kicked off to a very sort of limping start about 2 years ago. And only recently has the internet traffic in Cuba started to really gravitate completely toward that submarine fiber optic cable. Until last fall even, a good portion of Cuba's global internet access was going through satellites. That's just started to change in recent months. So everything's now going through the cable.
Ambassador, I know that you want to add something when Carlos Alberto was talking.
Yes, I think it was mostly addressed in other people's comments, but what I will say is that necessity is the mother of invention, and I understand the paquetes economy is an interesting way to distribute information. It's extremely inefficient, and it is not how Cuba is going to get online. As someone who works in the relationship between law, regulation, and markets, it just sounds insane, the way that this particular market is managed. But, you know, I think I know in talking to my Cuban colleagues and in talking to people on the ground in Cuba that, one, the people on the ground want access to the internet. They want real access to the internet. They want it in their homes. They want it to be affordable. Of
course.
And two, I sincerely believe that the government of Cuba knows it has to get that kind of access to its people. That in order for their people to not be left behind in the modern age, they have to have access to modern tools. Whether that be the cuenta propistas that they've allowed to go into business as restaurant owners or as people who rent out their homes on Airbnb, or themselves as the government in delivering government services to their people, you need a functional and advanced communications infrastructure to do it. We're prepared to help them do it, and we're going to move forward in that.
You're now preparing a new delegation to travel to Cuba. What is going to be the purpose of that trip?
The goal of the trip that we proposed to the Cuban government counterparts is to allow us to bring experts in academia, technical experts from the private sector who can talk about how access to the internet and the services they provide over the internet are helping other countries in similar situations succeed, and the people on the ground succeed. How it's an enabling technology for economic development and opportunity. And I believe that the Cuban government, at root, like all public servants, wants that for their people.
Have you tried to go to schools?
No, but, yes, we went to 2 universities when I was there, I'm sorry, but we spoke predominantly with faculty. But I would like to, at some point, go and speak to students as well.
Sure. Raul?
Just wanted to echo what the ambassador was saying, and I think you're absolutely spot on. The Cuban government, it seems, has realized that if it wants to attract the $2.5 billion of foreign direct investment per year for the next 10 years, right? If it wants to compete with Colombia and Chile and Peru and Mexico, which recently opened up its petrol industry, if it wants to compete, period, it has to be connected, right? For all the brands that are out there, all the companies out there, December 18th, the day after the announcement was made, our phone didn't stop ringing off the hook. Everybody and their mother wanted to invest in Cuba, right? And I think it was incredibly encouraging and kind of motivating. At the same time, we're talking about a country of 11 million people. It's not a huge market by any stretch, right? It's not a huge market. It's a decent market, but it's not a huge market. That is completely cut off and has almost zero spending capital, right? Very little purchasing power. So that's the key there, right? The government has realized if we want to increase for our own line of our pockets, we want to increase our tax base, we want to increase foreign direct investment, they're going to and they have to do that slowly. The key for them is control, right? Can we do this in a way where we maintain control over how quickly we roll out, over what is rolled out, how the access points, right? So I think you're completely on. I think now the question becomes, how can you make that carrot even bigger so the government, it's almost impossible to say, no, we can't, right? I think that's where a lot of the companies that maybe you all work for, a lot of the brands you all work for, can make that case, right? By advertising to a Cuban market, by thinking of the Cuban demo as something that's viable in the next 2 to 5 years. These are all things I think that build momentum and build pressure then here in the States for policy to change, as well as in Cuba for policy to change there as well.
Before go with the presentation of Ted,
Sí, yo quería añadir algo porque estamos hablando de Cuba y la internet para los cubanos, pero mira, vamos a poner una pausa en lo que el beneficio para nosotros y vamos a hablar de economía, sencillo. La internet en Cuba está definiendo turismo ahora mismo y turismo es uno de los principales renglones de la economía en Cuba. Es decir, yo he hablado con turistas que prefieren irse a Punta Cana porque sencillamente no quieren pasarse 15 días pagando $4.50 la internet la hora o $2. Entonces se van a Punta Cana. El turismo a Cuba es caro, es decir, ir a Cuba a hacer turismo es caro. Y de contra de eso tienen que pagarte, te dicen, ¿for what? ¿4.50 por una hora de conexión a internet? No, me voy a Punta Cana, que es parecido, y sencillamente no me voy a Cuba. Eso, indiscutiblemente, el gobierno se lo ha tenido que pensar. Normalmente
the government knows that.
The government knows that. Normalmente llegas y te haces un check-in en un hotel y te dan el password de la internet, pues es lo más normal del mundo.
Bueno, yo siempre digo que la decisión no es solamente una decisión política de dar acceso a internet, sino una decisión económica, porque el gobierno tiene a Texas, que es una compañía de monopolio, y si hay más internet, se cobra más, el gobierno se enriquece.
Se enriquece.
Y bueno, y eso se puede, teóricamente, se puede usar este dinero para los otros gastos en la economía, que son muchas, ¿no? Entonces, está conectado también, y yo creo que hay una pelea interna en el gobierno, los que están diciendo que hay que desarrollar eso por lo que nos va a dar económicamente, y hay otros que tienen miedo o que ven en internet un caballo de Troya que puede penetrar, y esa es la palabra que usó el vicepresidente Machado Ventura, sí. Ahora lo que quiero hacer es hablar un poco sobre lo que está haciendo Carlos Alberto junto a todo un grupo de otros blogueros y periodistas independientes, y yo veo aquí en el público algunos de ellos que se han hecho famosos usando Twitter, usando un poco de videos y también blogs para tratar de reportar al mundo, tanto dentro de Cuba como el mundo entero, otra narrativa de lo que está pasando en Cuba, de la perspectiva del cubano de a pie, como periodistas independientes o periodistas ciudadanos, que muchos identifican con esa idea. Y lo interesante es que no es lo mismo decir periodista independiente que decir disidente. Hay algunos que son las dos cosas a la vez, pero hay otros que luchan, critican desde dentro del sistema, que se identifican como revolucionarios, pero críticos, ¿no? Entonces voy a tratar de mostrar un poco este espectro de actores civiles dentro de la sociedad cubana, que ya está desafiando el periodismo tradicional en Cuba, tratando de crear un periodismo nuevo que responde a la demanda de información del pueblo, ¿no? Entonces, sorry, I forget sometimes what language I'm talking in. I'll say it in English as I explain it. So here we have a slide. If you look at the slides, whoever invented, this is a little card that you can buy to get access in the Cuban system called Nauta, and you pay by hour and it discounts from your card. Whoever designed the card was playing a sick joke on the Cubans, because you have to have the patience of a Buddha to wait for the dial-up to connect you to because of the slowness of the internet. So this is a person doing yoga with a logo of Etexa. So we've had some changes over the last 4 or 5 years in access and new phenomena. So the citizen journalism phenomena has been combined with the government's change in starting to open up cyber cafes. There's a joke in Cuba that we have cyber cafes, but they don't have internet and they don't have cafe, right? And so they're trying to solve that problem and respond to the demands of the people. I always say that 2 years ago, the government gave up the fight of trying to force people to get permission to travel abroad. And they finally said, okay, we're going to get rid of that restriction. Now the pressure's on the government, coming mostly from the people, outside of Cuba, yeah, but mostly from the people saying, no, we want internet. We want internet not for X or Y or Z political reason, but just because we're going to fall behind even further in the world if we don't have it. So this is just listing some of the things. There's a phenomenon of the paquete, which we've heard about before, which is fascinating because you have the paquete, which was invented by the people to serve the people, and the government said, well, wait a second, the content of the paquete is banal, is low class. So we're going to compete with it, and the government has tried with something called the mochila and the maletín. But most Cubans say, no quiero tu mochila, quiero mi paquete. So this is a meme that's floating around in Cuba saying, it's okay, but I prefer the one that hasn't been filtered already. So the thing that I've been talking about here, I'll just jump to, is this. Here we have a list of what I consider 8 of the most interesting projects that have gone from the blog into kind of independent journalism. So you have 14 Medio, you have On Cuba, Cuba Posible, Convivencia, Havana Times, La Joven Cuba, Periodismo del Barrio, and La Chiringa de Cuba. We can talk more about that later, but I just wanted to introduce them because all 8 of these, and there's actually probably 20 or so that are doing this, are trying to fill the space that was left, and it's actually a very big space, of providing original, critical content to the Cuban public about Cuban reality, reporting on this. And these people are really creating new Cuban journalism, starting with blogs and Twitter, but now moving really into journalism as a profession and journalism as a daily practice with ethics, with a bottom line. They're businesses, many of these, that are trying to actually convert this process or this project into a surviving, bottom line business that can make money and survive. And this environment is not easy. I can go on, but I wanted to maybe get some feedback or have other people chime in if they have comments.
Me?
We can open the microphone to the audience. We know that we have here from 14 Medio, Alejandro González. I would like to hear from you too. So I will pass the mic to you. Talk about 14 Medio and how you can get to the...
Thank you, Gloria. Gloria, thank you. For those of you who are not familiar with 14 Medio, basically it's Cuba's first online daily digital news platform. It was founded in May of 2014 by Cuba's most prominent blogger, Yoani Sanchez, and 14 Medio now acts as basically any other newspaper would act in any other part of the world, with news about what goes on inside Cuba, what goes on in other parts of the world, culture, econ, politics, op-eds, a little bit of everything. I support the work of 14 Medio because, as Ted was mentioning earlier, some of those projects there are trying to be commercial projects and endeavor. I support the role of 14 Medio here on the commercial side, looking on how to make sure that we can not only be a journalism venture, but also a media business venture. So I just want to mention very quickly what we are doing to reach our audience in Cuba and the strategies that we want to put in place. Most of these of the folks have said mobile. That's definitely a strategy that we want to continue using. The Cuban user, not everyone has access to a computer, but most people do have access to a phone. And mobile is definitely a way to reach that audience, whether it's through applications that they have access to on the Google Play Store or on the Apple Store that they download either through a third party or themselves, or through the Nauta service that now a lot of people have on their phones, which is basically just an email service. So when we think about user acquisition for 14 Medio in Cuba, getting to them through the phone is a very important way of doing it. The second way is through social media, as some of the colleagues have mentioned here as well. A lot of the users the folks in Cuba who have access to internet or who can get online have Facebook profiles and to some extent also Twitter. So it's not possible to advertise and have specific campaigns for Cubans on the island. Facebook does not allow that. Twitter does not allow that. But we have to find creative ways of getting to that audience through the social media channels that are not blocked. 14 Medio is blocked, the site itself. So circumventing that censorship through the use of social media is an incredible tool to do so. And a third way, and it all aligns really, is through the networks outside of Cuba. So family members who have friends and family inside of the island. A family member who shares a 14 Medio post on Facebook who lives in Miami has a pretty big chance of someone in Cuba seeing it, or someone who reads our news content here shares it via email to their family members inside of Cuba, and that way we've been able to penetrate and be able to reach a wider audience inside of the island. So as you think of really interacting with Cuba and Cuba coming online, it's not just typing in a website. It's really trying to be much more creative than that and using various distribution platforms to make that happen. Some of it is being able to be tracked. A lot of it ends up in el paquete and reaches a wider audience that is harder to quantify and to see. But what I guess I would like for you all to go away with from this conversation is the ingenuity is there if the will is there, and we certainly are seeing more and more people like Carlos Alberto, like La Joven Cuba, like Convivencia, all of those that you are having up there, with the will from inside of the island to narrate their own stories, to not have those stories be narrated from an outside media outlet. That's what 14 Medio is trying to do. That's what some of these other blogs are trying to do. And when you have that will and when you have that courage, because many of these people are also having a courage to dissent from the original way, you have the opportunity to provide to people new ways of finding information so that they can be the ones that make decisions about the future of their lives and their country based on information that they have been able to access on their own. And I think in one way or another, all of these outlets are trying to do that. So anyway, go check out 14 Medio and the other ones as well.
But at this point, there are more people outside Cuba that knows about 14 Medio and read 14 Medio than inside Cuba, right?
I think it's fair to say that we have a large audience outside of Cuba and that we have an ever more increasing audience inside of Cuba. If you look at official statistics that I can see through Google Analytics, the user acquisition that I'm actually seeing on Google Analytics from inside of Cuba, the growth is actually greater than the one inside, the growth is greater than from outside. And so more and more people are finding out about it, whether it's through proxies or whether it's through offline versions. And as we continue to amplify our distribution mechanisms inside of the island, more and more people are going to find out about it and have the courage to read it.
Thank you.
Let me just add one comment. Alejandro was very nice, and he talked about these various independent media outlets competing with the narrative of Cuba that's developed outside of Cuba. But they're also, and I think primarily, competing with the official story, with the official media, which has dominated, monopolized the conversation about Cuban reality inside the island. And here I have two quotes from two important thinkers, politicians in Cuba who kind of have sending mixed messages about this moment Miguel Díaz-Canel is Cuba's first vice president, and he is the heir apparent to become president after Raul Castro steps down in about 2.5 years. And he has made some comments that seem that he's open to negotiation or at least recognition of a reality instead of just trying to repress it or putting the head in the sand. He says to prohibit something is nearly an impossible chimera. It makes no sense. But there are other people, and there's a long tradition in Cuba of not tolerating dissent and not coexisting with other opinions, and instead of that, denigrating them, disqualifying them as anti-Cuban or as simply as mercenaries paid by our enemies to overthrow or undermine the government. And I think that's important, especially given the shift in American policy that we've seen the last 8 months. Obama was asked at the Summit of the Americas about regime change as a policy, and he said explicitly that the United States is not in the policy of regime change in Cuba, but it is going to keep supporting Cubans, yearning for a freer information environment and greater ability to determine their future. Congress, the U.S. Congress, is still officially in regime change business, and so there's this kind of issue with the changing U.S. policy. How will that impact the rhetoric and the treatment that the Cuban government has? Are they going to be less able to tar and feather dissenting voices, whether they're dissidents or not official dissidents or see themselves as dissidents but critics, by saying, hey, you're really an enemy, instead of allowing more space? There's an old African proverb, when the elephants battle, the grass suffers. Well, what happens when the elephants stop battling? Can that grass of the media, can the grass of independent businesses start to regrow because there's not this siege mentality, that we're under threat from an enemy? And I think this is why the dynamic is really interesting to watch right now, because people like Carlos Alberto, who position themselves within the tradition of the revolution, but are some of the biggest critics of its errors, its failures, are also pushing for, take advantage of these new spaces. And so it's a really dynamic space where people are really pushing the limits, taking their lumps, but living to fight another day, and so there's a whole range of this. And that's to me what's fascinating to watch, because the dynamic is shifting given the geopolitical changes.
Just quickly, I want to say that our mission in Cuba relative to access to the internet and to information is no different than anywhere else in the world. Whether you are a child growing up in Colombia or in Chile or in Mexico or in Cuba, we want you to have access to information, to the capacity to express yourself, to the capacity to organize, the capacity to build your capabilities and skills. So as we move forward, what's going to make change in Cuba is Cubans. And what you see is that you don't have to be a dissident to want access to the internet. In fact, I would say that the vast majority of the people in Cuba that we've interacted with, and from the Ben-Dixon survey, want access to the internet, even those that are not anti-Cuban government. At the end of the day, the pressure that will come from Cuba's people will drive the change in the Cuban government policies relative to access to the internet.
It is difficult, believe me, because they was born without knowing about internet. So they know now, but it's different when you are afraid of the government. That is so, the repression is really difficult. And I want to open the mic for Yusnavi Perez, a Cuban blogger that he was born in Cuba and created his blog, Yusnavi Post, in Cuba, but now he's living in Miami. Yusnavi, trata de decirnos a nosotros cómo tú lograste tener tantos seguidores que tienes ahora, más de 300,000 seguidores. ¿Cómo lo hiciste?
Sí, gracias Gloria. Bueno, yo empecé en Cuba en el 2013. Recuerdo el día que conecté con Carlos Alberto por Twitter. Él estaba diciendo que se había ido la corriente o que la guagua no iba a tiempo. Y fue muy interesante, y ese día dije, wow, sería increíble que todos los cubanos de algún modo pudiésemos interactuar con nosotros mismos por Twitter, o por internet, o por WhatsApp, o por lo que sea, ¿no? Y dije, bueno, aquí va a comenzar algo nuevo que va a ser Yusnavi. Mi nombre es Eduardo. Y dije, bueno, Yusnavi va a ser lo que yo quisiera ser. O sea, un cubano libre viviendo dentro de Cuba. Y creé mi blog, creé mis cuentas de Instagram, de Facebook. Y un buen día tuvo resultados, mis fotos, mis escritos, mis videos. Llegaron a millones de personas y hoy tengo casi 500,000 de seguidores en casi todas las redes sociales. Y ha sido increíble tanto ver cómo gente en Cuba se va conectando con estas nuevas tecnologías y con estas nuevas fuentes de información y cómo gente de otros países, digamos Venezuela, también siguen lo que pasa dentro de Cuba, ¿no? Por estas pequeñas ventanitas que somos nosotros.
Pero lo interesante es que tú lo hacías con un servidor en Europa, no dentro de Cuba.
Exactamente. Yo me conectaba en Cuba con un teléfono extranjero que hacía roaming en la isla. Para aquellos que dicen de que no hay infraestructura, sí la hay. Para los extranjeros residentes en la isla pueden tener internet. Para los turistas pueden tener internet 3G en su celular. Pero los cubanos todavía no tenemos el derecho en la isla de tenerlo. Yo espero que pronto podamos tenerlo. Como también tener telecables y esas tecnologías también, y teléfono fijo también en las casas, que es muy difícil tenerlo.
Thank you, Yusnavi.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I don't know if someone have a question to the panelists.
Hey, how you doing? How is the American government incubating businesses to help in Cuba?
I'm sorry, I would have to understand the question a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand, if I have a business here in the United States, I want to go to Cuba and help the infrastructure, the technology, the Wi-Fi, set up internet access over there for them. How could I do that?
What we've done is made it legal for you to do that. Now, the commercial arrangements that you would need to make, you would, in the first instance, likely have to go through the Cuban government to gain access to the Cuban market. They have an embassy in Washington, D.C. now and are accepting sort of applications for participation in the Cuban market, and you would have to go through that process to enter the Cuban market and participate in that market. What we've done is, again, create the legal environment in which it's possible for you to do so, and are continuing to advocate in front of the Cuban government, respectfully, for them to open up their market to our participants in that space.
Anything else? It's okay?
I wanted to share sobre el paquete, the paquete that, I'm sorry, what was his name? Carlos was talking about. I have a travel agency that brings people to Cuba for the last 20 years. And when I was there, as of like a year ago, the guy who brought the paquete to the house, I noticed it was a different guy. And I said, well, where's the other guy? And he told me, well, no, it's best that we mix it up so that they don't know, so they don't know who's bringing it. And the other thing about your the phone list, about once a month when I go with some clients, I bring clothes for my family, to sell. And what they do is they get this list, a new one every couple of months, and they do that. They send a text message to everybody. I don't know if it's Vedado itself or Havana, and so everybody knows that they have clothes.
The Cuban version of mobile marketing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's they don't have any push notification with respect to the web, but they still get their advertisement out that there's clothes.
Yeah, totally right. And the only thing I want to add, since it is Social Media Week, is that if you do work for a brand that is considering Cuba, there's a smart way about going about it. The same way there's a smart way about going about any kind of Hispanic or Latin market, right? Netflix is case in point, a brand that was ridiculed, not so much outside of Cuba, but inside of Cuba for their kind of social media work around this policy changes. Netflix announces that Netflix is now available in Cuba, and they kind of did a big rollout on Twitter and thought they were going to get like a lot of kudos. Problem is that nobody has capacity to watch Netflix in Cuba, right? So it's kind of a dud, and people in Cuba were kind of like caught, like when they found out about the news like a couple months later, or a couple weeks later, they're like, whatever, this doesn't really make sense. A flip side of that, right? Airbnb. Airbnb does a phenomenal job of realizing that it's their business model, works well there. In Miami, their ad in the Herald kind of kind of struck a bad chord. The ad basically parodied or alluded to the moon landing and saying the access to 1,000 Cuban homes are now available to you. When you're talking to people these are their former homes, right? So in Miami, it didn't ring true. It was great in DC, great in New York, great out in the West Coast, because it talked about that local, authentic experience. And that's what, in general, millennials are looking for. They're looking for authentic local experiences. People are looking for that in Cuba. That's what Cuba has to offer. So the same thing that Joanna was talking about before in the panel before, being genuine, right, and being authentic, it's the exact same thing when it comes to Cuba. And when you have a brand who is trying to force it the way Netflix was trying to force it, Cubans may not know all the social media channels, but they know what's authentic and what isn't, right? They know that the propaganda they've been getting for 55 years is not authentic, and they know that when a company like Airbnb comes in and gives you an opportunity, they know that is authentic, that messaging is, that brand is authentic. So to the extent that you can just bring your same self and the same ethos to the Cuban market, that's probably your best bet.
Okay.
Just one comment on that. I think most Cubans were even aware that Netflix launched in Cuba. So I think it maybe had an effect on them in the United States, but obviously it didn't have the effect in Cuba since they're not operating. Then second, with Airbnb, from what I was told, up until a month or so ago, you couldn't get money out of Airbnb. So Airbnb was great for the United States and for Airbnb, but the actual Cuban homeowners weren't getting paid because there was no way that they could do a bank transfer from Airbnb in Cuba. But my question is, what companies besides Netflix and Airbnb are from the United States are doing business today in Cuba?
So, yeah, I would only add in there that, so really quickly, on the Netflix, they didn't find out about it immediately when Netflix pushed it on Twitter. They found out about it like a week or two before in the paquete and other things, or people talking about how Netflix was coming to Cuba, but then them realizing it doesn't really affect them. With Airbnb, yeah, Airbnb normally you put in your bank information, you get a direct deposit when you cash out, when the person comes. In Cuba, you have to be paid in cash by a remittance agency, so there is a huge lag. The system is working, there's a huge kind of latency to it.
Yeah, so I would just point out, so IDT did sign a long-term agreement. So, you know, we do have instances of this. Nearshore Americas conducted a survey of 317 Cuban IT professionals on the island in May, and over half of them reported that they worked with foreign firms as freelancers. So, and you know, the major market was the United States, and then subsequently other markets in Latin America, also Spain. So it is happening. It hasn't been sort of the marquee American names that are signing contracts, but no, it's definitely happening.
And I would, so not to call anybody out.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to call anybody out, but the Zubis of the world, the Chris Porters of the world, the Sapiens of the world are subcontracting work to coders here in Miami, who then, and the companies knowingly, they know this, they're subcontracting work to Miami who then gets subcontracted to Cuba, and that's been the case for years, right? So you have incredible coding and programming talent in Cuba, and if you are one of the lucky few who has connectivity, you can do the work that somebody would do here for any of these ad agencies. So a lot of the digital ad work that's coming out of Miami, some of it was coming out of Cuba. Now it's legal for these companies and these firms to hire the Cubans directly, whether or not they're doing it is TBD, right? But whether or not it was happening under the table, technically not legally, it was. And again, the market drives demand. If you can get a Cuban coder for a 10th or a 20th of what an American employee would cost you, with the same quality or higher quality, right? Because they're self-taught, they really know the subject matter. Why not? So I think, again, you're going to see Cuba become a talent hub in the way that Buenos Aires or Bangalore has become a talent hub, because that's what Cuba has to export.
I would add, so one of the really fascinating paradoxes of IT in Cuba is that we have this very poor connectivity existing alongside a well-educated population. And so in fact, there are a lot of STEM graduates in Cuba, and a lot of these people are applying their skills as freelance software developers, and they excel across the gamut of Python, Java, .NET, PHP, even things like Ruby on Rails. Currently, because the internet is so unreliable and the equipment is frankly so bad, they're not able to really work in real time with foreigners, but they are able to work on the island. Increasingly, they're able to work on larger projects because they are forming these little freelance groups, cooperatives, which are, proto-corporations is what they are. They're proto-corporations, and they're even giving each other these very, these titles like CEO and so this is already happening. The wage is tricking upward right now. It's looking like about $450 to $500 a month. The average software programmer is making in Cuba. Again, they're freelancing. That doesn't sound like much, but then again, the average Cuban is making 20 to 25 bucks a month in their state jobs, so they're doing pretty well.
And to have a better understanding of how poor is the connectivity inside Cuba, and people basically doesn't know about the internet connection. This happened a few weeks ago. I'm gonna play a video, and they asked people on the street basically, if you know Facebook. No, we don't have audio.
Está caro el Facebook, hermano. No, está muy caro, no hay acceso. Es muy difícil. ¿Cómo?
No tengo celular. Bueno, sé que la gente que vive en él y todo eso se conocen, pero ahí en fuera no hacemos nada.
Yo no sé ni lo que es una computadora. Preguntique, hermano, ¿sabes qué cosa es Facebook? No. ¿Nunca has utilizado Facebook? No, para nada. Eso no existe aquí. En este pueblo no existe. Sí, claro. ¿Lo has utilizado? Sí, todos los días. Ahora mismo voy para allá. Yo voy todos los días. Ahora mismo voy para allá. ¿Todos los días? Facebook, Messenger, Imo, todas las aplicaciones que hay. Voy para allá. ¿Conoces Facebook?
No, porque no he tenido oportunidad de conectarme en Facebook. Sí, tengo amigos míos que se han conectado, que han dicho que eso es bueno, que eso te sirve para relacionarte mucho con el mundo y eso. Sí, me han comentado eso, pero no he tenido la oportunidad todavía de conectarme.
A través de ella podemos comunicarnos con nuestros familiares, amistades de diferentes países, diferentes lugares donde se publican artículos, tanto buenos como malos.
¿Tú cuántas veces las utilizas?
Bueno, depende cómo esté la economía, porque realmente el impuesto de internet está bien fuerte, está bien caro, récord en el mundo entero.
Yo utilizo Facebook como 50, 60 veces a la semana, fácil, y más si estuviera en mi país, porque en todos lados en el mundo esto es una cosa que es gratis.
¿Estás de acuerdo con que esté en 12 UC la hora?
No, pero yo no soy quien para decir nada de eso, porque yo no vivo aquí.
Esta tarde fue que pude conectarme, porque he venido otras 2 veces y no... Pero bueno, parece que hay menos personas, no sé cómo es. Demasiado caro.
Una red social que permite conocer amistades, estar en contacto con amigos que no viven en el país.
¿Qué tiempo lo usa usted en una semana?
Bastante limitado.
Que tienen que poner más antenas y eso para podernos conectar más rápido. Bueno, caro es, lo que pasa es que trabajo y no tengo tiempo para venir.
Gracias. ¿Y usted ha usado internet?
Primera vez que vengo en mi vida.
¿Y cómo se siente?
Bueno, tratando a ver si me puedo conectar para hablar conmigo.
¿Desde aquí? No importa. No lo uso, me paso el día trabajando.
¿Qué tiempo usan Facebook?
Bueno, tiempo 1 hora, porque la tarjeta vale 3 pesos y para conectarse en este parque es 1 hora porque la conexión no entra. Bueno, Facebook es una página muy buena, pero aquí, como es, ahora llevo 1 hora tratándome de conectar y no puedo, pues la señal está muy mala.
¿Es muy lenta?
Es demasiado, demasiado.
¿En la semana cuántas veces utilizan Facebook?
Bueno, a veces cuando tengo los 3 pesos que puedo ir a conectar.
Hotspots
So you
that
see,
the government
that's
set
Cuba,
up in a park.
basically. It's really funny.
Sí, a ver. Es muy gracioso. A ver, son 35 puntos de hotspots de Wi-Fi solamente. Es decir, pero además, cada punto puede tener conectado 100 personas. Es decir, 100 personas a un ancho de banda de 1 megabyte. Es decir, estamos hablando de que te conectas a 1 megabyte. Ni siquiera es que te conectas a 4, a 8, a 10 megabytes. Entonces, 100 personas a 1 megabyte, por supuesto que pone la red y el servidor a full. Y entonces es muy inestable. Estás pagando un servicio súper caro por una cosa muy inestable. El rango, la semana pasada estuve con Mark Wells y Alex Lee. Nos fuimos a Marianao, cerca de donde vivo yo. por allá por 124, y porque ellos querían ver, ¿no?, cómo era la cosa, ¿no? Entonces le decía, mira, es algo muy interesante porque en este punto la gente viene aquí, no viene a darle play a YouTube o a estudiar en Wikipedia o a buscar información científica. La gente está utilizando estos puntos para comunicarse. Es muy cómico porque tú ves la gente, y como es el cubano, ¿no?, como somos nosotros, gritando, oye, muchachita, ¿cómo tú estás? No sé qué, mándame esto, mándame lo otro. Entonces, todo el mundo comunicándose vía videoconferencia, porque es lo que más la gente ahora mismo está necesitando. Entonces, por eso la gente no puede conocer Facebook. ¿Por qué? Porque el FaceTime está bloqueado, porque Skype está bloqueado. Entonces vinimos a descubrir una aplicación que le decimos IMO o IMO, que como decimos nosotros, pincha en talla, y podemos hablar y podemos vernos con toda nuestra familia en cualquier lugar del mundo por esta vía. Y entonces, evidentemente, este panorama tendrá que ir cambiando, ¿no? Esta muchacha dice, la tarjetita vale 3 pesos, no, la tarjeta vale 2, pero ella la compra 3 porque Telsa, en ninguno de los puntos que tiene alrededor del país, tiene un kiosco en la esquina que venda tarjeta. Por tanto, tienes que ir a hacer la cola de Telsa, que es la misma cola de pagar el teléfono, la misma cola de conectarte a internet en la máquina, la misma cola de pagar no sé qué, para comprar una tarjeta de internet. Y entonces la gente, el revendedor, como es el cubano de sobreviviente, lo que hace es que compra 40, 50 tarjetas, y entonces te la vende o a $3, cuando vale 2, o te vende 2 por 5 pesos. Y entonces el fenómeno es muy complicado, así no podemos llegar muy lejos.
Exacto. Esos son los desafíos que se enfrenta. Aquí hay otro video que quiero compartir también, es bien cortito, dura 2 minutos, sobre cómo, how people connect to Wi-Fi in Cuba.
Todos los días tenemos aquí es tener que comprar las tarjetas sobre precio, las de media hora a 1.50 y las de 1 hora a 3 pesos.
He ido al punto que está cerca de Cubana, he ido al Fonsa, he ido al Obispo, he ido al Parque del Purita, y en todos los lugares te dicen que no hay tarjeta. Entonces, la única opción que uno tiene para si quiere conectarse a internet es que del parque y te la venden a 3 pesos, que no debería ser así. No es justo. Además, ¿qué hacen con todas esas tarjetas que hace el Estado? ¿Qué las hacen? Las que venden por cantidades a alguien y
You can hear. Well, next time. So thank you very much. I think we cover almost everything. I don't know if you want to add something, Ambassador Ted.
No, just thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah.
Yo quiero decir algo antes de terminar. Nosotros somos especialistas en romper los bloqueos. La conexión vale 12 UC la hora, ¿no es verdad? Ahora, Connectify es una aplicación que la gente de aquí, de Connectify en Estados Unidos, parece que quisieron vernos a nosotros, ¿no? Entonces, liberaron el código para Cuba. Sí, desde Cuba se puede descargar Connectify for free y no tienes que poner ningún crack ni nada. Y entonces, lo que están haciendo la gente, para que ustedes vean cómo funciona la cosa, y así, Gloria, respondo a la pregunta tuya de cómo el pueblo cubano puede expandirse mucho más en internet. Pues la gente lo que hace es que con esa tarjeta de 1 hora instala el Connectify en la laptop y llega esta persona que está dando vueltas y está buscando gente y te dice internet a 1 hora, a la hora a peso, la hora a peso, la hora a peso. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que hace? Así, a peso es un CUC. Entonces, lo que hace es que su conexión la comparte con 5 personas más. Le sale, 5 o 6, le sale su internet gratis, su hora de internet gratis y se está ganando 3 CUC a través del Connectify, que Connectify lo que hace es crear un hotspot que te da servicio con una sola conexión de internet. Por supuesto que si tienes 1 mega y la partes en 5 pedazos, como decimos nosotros. Pero bueno, por lo menos está resolviendo para revisar Gmail, Facebook y algunas cosas, ya no videoconferencia.
Carlos Alberto, ayer estábamos hablando entre nosotros y tú me explicaste unas de las estrategias que tienes como bloguero, bloguear desde Cuba con poca o ninguna conexión, que son estrategias, imagino, comunes. ¿Podrías hablar un poco de cómo se hace, cuáles son las estrategias? Pero no todos los secretos, porque queremos que sigas blogueando.
No, a ver, nosotros hemos tenido siempre que quitarnos nuestras propias barreras, ¿no? Y por ejemplo, Hay veces que estando trabajando si tienes acceso a internet y puedes resolver, pero hay veces que no. Entonces, ¿cómo te informas? Por ejemplo, hay una aplicación que se llama Feed Reader, que es algo parecido al Google Reader ese que había, que Google quitó. Entonces, esta aplicación, por ejemplo, yo la tengo en un portable, una aplicación portable. En esta aplicación, cuando tú te conectas a internet, tienes la posibilidad de configurar todos los sitios que tú lees. Es decir, yo tengo prensa cubana, prensa extranjera, blogs, en fin, yo lo configuro todo. Eso es por RCS. Y sencillamente, cuando llego y me conecto a internet, la aplicación sola se conecta y descarga todos los RSS. Pues, ¿qué hago yo? Por ejemplo, cuando no tengo internet, le doy la memoria flash mía porque es un portable, le doy la memoria mía a mi vecino que sí tiene internet y le digo, bueno, ves a tu trabajo y por la tarde, a finalizar del día, la conectas. Entonces, esta aplicación se conecta a internet, descarga toda la información y me la trae por la noche. Entonces, yo desde mi casa, desde mi laptop, pues estoy ya leyéndome todas las noticias que salen en todos los medios y en todas las cosas.
¿Cuánto te demora a ti todo ese proceso?
Eso es muy rápido una vez lo tengas bien configurado. Es decir, eso en 3 minutos se descargó todo. Es increíble. Es como RCS. Cuando configuras RCS, te conectas y enseguida te descargan los RCS. Yo espero al final del día para que se descargue todo lo que pasó en el día y entonces pues después me paso la noche entera. Y como digo eso, puedo decir, por ejemplo, el Juno, hay una aplicación que se llama Juno de Mozilla Firefox, que es un complemento del Firefox, que increíblemente acceder a Twitter desde Cuba es muy lento, porque las conexiones son muy lentas. Y entonces con el Juno se te abre una pequeña, parecido a esta otra aplicación, bueno, en fin, una pequeña ventanita a la izquierda del navegador y entonces ahí puedes configurar Twitter, Facebook, Gtalk, puedes configurar todas las redes y te baja igual como RCS, si no tienes que entrar a la página real y estás informado y tiene todo, tiene los followers, tiene las menciones, los hashtags, lo tiene todo. Facebook, la gente lo que hace es, ustedes se van a reír, pero la gente lo que hace desde una computadora se conecta por la versión móvil. ¿Cómo? En vez de poner facebook.com, la gente pone, o nosotros ponemos m.facebook.com.